Now to Uzbekistan, where the music of rappers such as Shoru, who you can hear there, was denounced last week on state television. And it wasn't only rap. In a documentary called Melody and Calamity, rock and roll was also condemned as a dark cloud over the heads of Uzbek youth, epitomised by sadism, drug addiction and immorality. Well, the Uzbek establishment certainly isn't the first to voice such objections, but is something particular going on here? In a country where 90% of the inhabitants are Muslim, the secular government is wary of religious extremism, but in recent months it's also shown increasing impatience with cultural imports from the West. And when I spoke with the head of the BBC's Central Asian Service, Hamid Ismailov, I put it to him that the TV documentary, which represents the threat of rap and rock as a nuclear mushroom cloud, is being deliberately frightening.
It is. I must say that the contributors, the actors, the musicians and so on and so forth, they were not so much hawkish as the narrator. The narrator was so hawkish. He was saying things like, for example, that the rock music is coming from the hunting rituals of African tribes, or, for example, that the rap music was born in the prisons of America, therefore these oversized clothings of the rappers and so on and so forth. It was the worst of the Soviet propaganda.
It sounds a bit like the television commercials they used to have here to warn people about the dangers of AIDS. I mean, as though it was quite deliberately over the top and like a horror movie.
You can understand why they are doing that, because if you go to the history of rock and rap, in the 90s the authorities instructed the local authorities to have lots of discos, especially in the Fergana Valley, to fight the Islamization of the country and Islamization of the youth. So all kind of discos were arranged, all kind of genres of rock and rap music mushroomed at that time, and all of a sudden they realized that it is a force which you have to think about, especially in the light of what's happening now in the Middle East. Any gatherings are unwanted now in Uzbekistan, any gathering of youth especially, and rock music, rap music could gather youth, you know, in masses. So therefore the authorities apparently are afraid of these gatherings.
I wondered about the role of the classical Uzbek musicians in this documentary, because they're there saying, you know, the youth should be listening to classical Uzbek music, this is what's good for them. Which is a bit, I suppose, like in France, for instance, where they desperately try, and they have quotas indeed, to make sure that people listen to indigenous French music as well as to imported music. I mean, are these musicians really just looking after their own interests when they try and stop the youth from listening to rock and rap?
I think they were a bit, you know, confused because they've been asked to take part in this film, and they were trying their best. I mean, they were naturally sort of talking about love to the national music, which is understandable, you know, everyone loves his or her national music. But at the same time, they were not as hawkish as they were expected by the authorities. The most hawkish person was the narrator.
I mean, your wife, I know, is a classical Uzbek musician. What's her stand on people listening to rock?
Yeah, he considers that every genre has its own listenership. For example, it's marginal in Uzbekistan. The rock and rap is quite marginal. And they've got the roots in folk music as well. For example, Katta Ashula, or the great singing like Cante Hondo, Spanish Cante Hondo, plays with the sounds like rock music. Or, for example, Masharabos, the clowns of the cities, for example, they use the rap in their folklore. So the roots of this music in popular culture as well. You can understand if, for example, the authorities wanted to be so puritanic about the culture, they could have, as many observers say, abolish, for example, the fashion shows of the president's daughter, you know, because semi-naked ladies, for example, catwalking, it's quite far away from the national sort of dress of Uzbeks and so on and so forth. So I think the main point here and the main target is the gatherings of youth.
Then we shouldn't see this as a shift by the Uzbek government, that it's beginning to be more pro-Islamist, for instance, that it's trying to court Islamist voters?
No, it's the other way around. They are afraid of Islamism. They are afraid of any sort of gatherings in the mosques or wherever the gatherings are. On the other hand, it's a trend, for example. They've abolished, for example, they've banned two Russian musical channels, entertainment channels in Uzbekistan. The same trend, for example, you can see in the sort of censorship on the net, for example. They are afraid of new technologies which bring people together under the Western values.
Hamid Ismailov, head of the BBC's Central Asian Service, and incidentally the BBC World Service writer in residence.